Hi, this is Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 9.
Chapter 9. Ellen noticed the change in JoBeth immediately. She had been in bed when they returned home that evening. He assumed she was still not feeling well, but that was a month ago, and later, she still had not emerged from the room she shared with Shauna. He became concerned. "I better get a doctor up here," Alan said at the dinner table. JoBeth had refused supper again for the third night in a row. The remaining three sat silently, eating the meal Jonah had prepared. He placed his hands on the table, bracing himself to get up. His intent was to go to town to fetch the doctor. It didn't matter if they had to leave when JoBeth and Jonah were discovered. She was sick, and he could not let her go without medical attention. "Alan," Jonah said softly, looking up from his plate of vegetable stew. "No doctor can help JoBeth. She got a sickness of the heart that only she can heal." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Alan stormed angrily, his face displaying a look of disgust. "Don't be asking me something I can't tell ya," Jonah said to the red-faced youth. "There's gonna come a time when you gonna have to listen with your heart and not your ears." This just made Alan angrier. He could not understand what Jonah was talking about. "And I know you're getting hot under the collar, but that is too bad. If you want to help JoBeth, you sit down and finish your supper. She will be up and at it tomorrow. We gonna let her be for tonight," Jonah said with finality. He lifted his spoon and shoved it into his mouth forcefully, chewing his food without tasting it. Alan was too stunned for words. He plunked down in his chair and stared resentfully at his half-eaten stew. "Now, tell me about your day at school. You learning to read?" Jonah said, changing the subject. He listened intently while eating his dinner, as Shauna chatted about daily activities and a girl at school who was mean to all the other children. Jonah listened intently as Alan, defeated, began to eat again. His eyes transfixed on the bedroom door where JoBeth slumbered deep in mourning. After Alan and Shauna had left the next day, Jonah walked hesitantly to the door of JoBeth's retreat. Shauna had been sleeping in the loft with him and Alan since JoBeth began hibernating. He paused, dreading what he had to do. Knowing he could not put it off any longer, he walked into the dark, dank room. It smelled stale and slightly sour. He swiftly crossed the area between himself and the window, pushing open the curtains. A ray of sunlight bathed the room, exposing a pale, dark-eyed form on the bed. JoBeth protested, burying her head in the pillow. Her frail body withered under Jonah's angry gaze as he placed his solid hands on his hips. "You can lay there and slowly die if you want, but you are needed around here. You got a bad loss that come to you, but life has many belly aches to hand out to all of us," Jonah growled, hating himself. "We need you, and we are the living. Little Jonah is gone. I am ashamed that he is looking down from heaven with the angels and seeing his ma's a quitter, letting herself get so consumed with the misery that she neglects the living that loves and needs her." He shook his head sadly. "There will be tears in heaven right now, 'cause you forgot about us and how we need you." He turned towards the door, his feet dragging reluctantly on the hardwood floor. As he reached for the handle, he turned back and added softly, trying not to see JoBeth's red-rimmed eyes. "There's lots of work to be done around here, and I can't do it alone. I need my best friend to help me." He walked out of the room, closing the door behind him, his pleas thick and heavy in the air. Lifting her head from the pillow, JoBeth gazed toward the window, her eyes squinting from the bright light. Tears she thought were all dried up fell anew. She wiped them away with the back of her hand and slowly sat up. every inch of her body feeling bone-weary. She swiveled her head towards the bedroom door and mustered all her strength. "Least you can do is draw me a bath," she roared with all her might. With his hand grasping onto the door handle, Jonah leaned against the door. Taking a deep breath, he smiled, released his grip, and went to fetch the washtub. "I suppose I could do that by myself," he responded. Alan was surprised when JoBeth finally surfaced, weak as a kitten, but seemingly better after her ordeal. Jonah had been right. It was just a matter of time before she came around. He still did not understand what had happened to cause her to hide from view for over a month, but he trusted Jonah and obeyed his wishes. JoBeth had lost a lot of weight, and the dark circles under her eyes worried him. She seemed very sad, but at least she was not sick. As time passed, the circles that ringed her eyes began to fade just as the snow began to melt and spring started to bloom. JoBeth ached for her dead son, but her heart started to heal slowly with the love of the two boys and Shauna. She seldom spoke to Jonah about the baby, but felt a great bond with the young man who was decades older than his 16 years. Then again, she too was much wiser than her own age of 15. The two frequently went to visit the tiny grave. They would sit silently, absorbed in the tranquil atmosphere. When the snow finally melted, just as JoBeth had envisioned, the grass grew tall, alive with small animals and birds. Tiny budded heads pressed out of the earth, and soon the field was speckled with multicolored wildflowers. "It is nice here," JoBeth said, smelling a small red flower she had carefully uprooted. She planned to replant it onto the child's grave. Jonah turned, placing the small cross he had constructed on the ground. Breathing deeply of the spring scents bursting forth around him, he wiped his sweaty brow. "Good place," he sighed, looking around him. "Feels like God is right here." JoBeth agreed. "Jonah?" "Yes?" He continued with the work at hand. He would have to dig a deep hole to support the wooden crucifix. JoBeth stared at his naked, strong back, rippling and glistening with sweat. In the midst of the heat, he had removed his shirt. It was impossible not to admire his beauty. "Thank you." "For what?" He turned to face her again, shovel in hand. "For everything." She pretended exasperation. She stood up and walked to him. "I love you, all right?" She clasped his face between the palms of her hands. Soft and warm against his skin, as she leaned into him, resting her forehead against his. He mirrored her movement, placing his hands lightly against her cheeks. Their eyes closed, both of them feeling a powerful connection beyond friendship, beyond romance. A bond stronger than either of them had ever known. The two pieces of a puzzle seamlessly melded together, as though they were part of the same whole, one and the same. Two slices of the same pie. They just never knew it until now. "Aw, heck," Jonah replied, embarrassed. A blush spread across his dark skin as he turned away from her, trying to hide his burning cheeks. "I love you, too." She fell backward, sitting back on the ground, giggling so hard that her stomach hurt. "What is so funny?" he said, pretending to be offended. "I don't know. You?" She chuckled, sat up, and rubbed tears out of her eyes. She had not laughed so hard in ages. In fact, she could not remember ever laughing so intensely. "What would I ever do without you, Jonah?" "You would be just fine," he smiled, trying to hide his own urge to laugh. It felt good to see JoBeth smile with color on her face. "Aren't we an unlikely pair?" "You know it." Jonah laughed out loud in his deep, rich voice. She smiled as his comforting laughter echoed in the air. Leaning back against her elbows, she closed her eyes, allowing the warm summer breeze to run its fingers through her hair. The sound of chirping birds and the warm sun on her skin made her feel at peace. As she opened her eyes, she noticed the delicate red flower she had picked earlier lying on the grass. She bent down and lightly touched its silky petals that were already beginning to wilt. She gently brushed the petals against her lips. She needed to plant it as soon as Jonah was done placing the cross, before it dies. She paused, the petals still against her lips, reflecting on the bittersweet beauty of life. Just like us, she thought. Just like us. A week later, the two were cooking supper when Alan ran into the house after finishing his work at the mill. Thanks to Jonah's carpentry work, the house was fully furnished and looked like a comfortable, modest home. Jonah and JoBeth had worked hard to create the type of place they wished to live in, and they succeeded. "JoBeth, Jonah!" Alan yelled from the doorway. "Come and see what I brought home." JoBeth could not help but smile at his excitement. Her heart fluttered when she thought of him. Jonah noticed how she flushed over Alan and smiled. He saw the same look on Alan's face every time he was near JoBeth. She wiped her hands on her apron and removed the cooking chicken from the fireplace. "Come on, girl, move," Jonah coaxed, grabbing her hand and dragging her outside. Both stopped in their tracks as they stepped onto the wooden veranda steps. JoBeth's eyes widened in disbelief. On the lush green grass, a small cow with black and white spotted fur was leisurely grazing. Its head was down, and a rope of soft leather connected to a collar around its neck was held in Shauna's hand. JoBeth gasped, covering her mouth with her raised hands. "Wow!" Jonah yelped, jumping down from the porch. "A cow!" He went up to the beast and began to pet it. "Milk and butter and cream and—" JoBeth started to laugh, jumping down to join them. "Alan, how wonderful!" Alan stood back proudly. This had been a dream of his. "We can't have a home without a cow. Shauna, show her." The child laughed and pulled out small packages from behind her back. "Seeds!" she squealed. JoBeth grabbed the small packages from her hands and recited the writing on them. "Radishes, potatoes, carrots." She squeezed the envelopes to her chest. "Vegetables, vegetables! Finally, some vegetables!" "Are you happy?" Alan asked, suddenly standing beside her. The desire to sweep her lithe body into his arms and touch her lips longingly to his moved through him. His heart pounded, sending powerful waves of blood rushing through his veins. The scent of her hair, fresh as the morning dew, sweet like strawberries and thick as honey, bathed his senses. He grew dizzy for her. "Very," JoBeth whispered, aware of his strong male presence. She gazed into his eyes, her breath failing her. "Thank you." She placed her hand on his warm cheek and, without thinking, leaned over and kissed him softly on his smooth lips. Alan's fingers curled around her slender wrist, his face moved closer to hers. He exhaled slowly as their lips parted. The sweet scent of her breath mingled with his own. A surge of heat, tingling like pins and needles, spread over JoBeth's body. She opened her eyes, staring back at his piercing gaze. Embarrassed, she pulled away, covering her mouth with the back of her hand. Alan was confused. Did he offend her? One moment he felt as he had never felt before, and the next he felt as though he had committed some heinous crime. Her essence still lingered in his nostrils as he gazed into her eyes. No, he felt her respond to him. It was not his imagination. He squeezed her hand and ran towards Shauna and Jonah, who were too engrossed in the cow to notice them. "What we gonna name her?" Alan shouted, running down to where Shauna and Jonah patted the cow. Jo Beth stood still, her heart pounding rapidly in her chest, staring after Alan and wondering what she had done. "How about Edna?" Jonah bellowed, picking Shauna up and placing her on the cow's back. "Edna?" Shauna and Alan questioned in chorus. "Yes." Jonah puffed up his chest, pretending to be hurt. "I had an aunt named Edna once. Yup, Aunt Edna. If I remember right, she looked just like this here old cow." Shauna and Alan threw their heads back and cackled with laughter as Jonah sputtered. Jo Beth tried to hold back a smile, but a giggle escaped her lips as she looked at Alan's toned shoulders, rising and falling with each resounding laughter. She felt confused, still feeling the pressure of his lips on hers. She touched them. How was that possible? How could she feel this way after what Father James had done? She cringed with disgust at the mere thought of his touch. But Alan was different. He was gentle. His lips were soft and caring, and she longed to feel them pressed against hers again. After Edna and the new seeds came into their lives, Jonah and Jo Beth had more to occupy their busy days. Jo Beth did not miss going into town. Jonah was more than enough company for her during the day, and in the evenings, she had all three of them to absorb her time. She felt loved and needed once again. Life seemed livable. Jonah and Jo Beth quickly set themselves to work, fixing a barn for Edna and starting a garden. Fortunately, her mother had taught Jo Beth at an early age how to make dairy products, so Edna became a great luxury in their lives. Jo Beth, a girl has to know how to make edible foods with what she has, her mama would say, looking down at the little girl. She no longer cried when she thought about her parents and the life they once shared together. She was only thankful that they had taught her well. The knowledge her parents had bestowed upon her before they died had proven to be very useful. Jo Beth thought of them now with loving memories. They had served her well. Every time Jo Beth milked Edna or was making butter or cheese, she would remember her mother and her calm voice telling her how to do this or that. It was just like when she had been on the run with Shauna. She remembered Pappy's strong voice telling her how to build a fire or make a snare. They left Jo Beth prepared to survive alone, and for that, Jo Beth was forever grateful. Her parents were still protecting her and watching out for her. Alan kept surprising them with gifts. A month after Edna's arrival, Alan came home with 2 live hens, a rooster, some flour, and 2 pigs. But the best surprise of all was Queenie, a little puppy Alan and Shauna found half-starved and abandoned by the creek. They brought her home and nursed the light brown mutt back to health. Everything was going well. The 4 had everything they could hope for. They had a real home full of love and kindness, something most of them had never experienced before. And they had livestock to sustain them. They even had a watchdog. What more could they ask for? Fall rolled around quickly, changing the green leaves of summer to bright red and yellow. The warm air began once again to turn cool and crisp. A year had passed since the 4 left the other members of their little family. Early one morning, Jo Beth and Jonah started pulling out the remaining vegetables from their garden. They had harvested enough for winter and were storing the food in a cellar Jonah had built behind the house during the past summer. "Do you ever wonder what happened to the others?" Jo Beth asked while brushing dirt from a carrot with her gloved hand. The garden had thrived under their care, and she was very pleased. Gardening was becoming a passion of hers. Little seeds bursting forth with life never seemed to bore her. She could spend hours in her vegetable garden, unaware of time passing. Next spring she planned to add a flower bed. Jonah stopped what he was doing and looked at his dirty hands. He did not like to wear gloves, He said he liked to get his hands right into the earth. It made him feel closer to nature. He truly believed that was why the vegetables grew so well. He was a firm believer in coddling the garden, treating it with loving care. The two of them so in sync with one another. "Yes, all the time," he said, arching his back. He had been bent over digging and picking potatoes for a while, and a stitch had begun to gnaw on his spine. "I just hope they have fared as well as we have," Jonah replied, testing his new vocabulary. JoBeth and Shauna had been teaching him and Alan how to read and write. During this time, their slang was disappearing, much to both Alan's and Jonah's pleasure. "I guess we'll never know," Jonah continued, picking potatoes. He felt suddenly sad. The others rested heavily on his chest. He felt guilty for the fine life he was living. The likelihood that the others had done as well was slim. "You don't mean that, do you? We will find them someday." Jonah looked up into the sky. "It's not for us to know. God willing, they will be back in our graces. But there is no use letting dreams like that eat at your mind. Some things in life happen that we don't much like. But life doesn't have to be fair." "That is something I do know," JoBeth spoke softly. "That is something we all know," Jonah replied, returning to the potatoes at hand. JoBeth sat by the roaring fire after dinner, lazily working on some mending. The nights were getting cooler, and the mornings were filled with a world covered in frost. She felt content being inside the warm little house. Shauna was fast asleep in their bed, and Alan and Jonah sat at the dinner table figuring out the accounts. Queenie, who had been sleeping by JoBeth's feet, stood up and began to growl. She was not fully grown yet and was already taller than the largest pig they owned. Alan looked up from the table, and JoBeth put her sewing down, glancing at the door. Someone knocked abruptly and insistently. Queenie began to growl louder, and JoBeth placed her hand on the dog's back. Her ears went down, and she began to whine. The knock came again, louder. "Alan?" asked a deep voice behind the door. "It's me, Simpson." He knocked again, a little more forcefully. Alan, close to hysteria, stood up and pointed for Jonah and JoBeth to disappear. "The loft! Go!" he whispered in a panic. They obeyed by jumping up and quickly climbing to the loft. Messing his hair, Alan yelled out, "Coming!" He opened the door, pretending to tuck in his shirt. "Come in," Alan said, moving away from the door. His heart pounded, and he fought the urge to look up at the loft. Two men followed behind the person named Simpson. "Kurt, Dean," Alan said, nodding to the other men. The two in question looked younger than the man Simpson, but they all looked quite similar, with closely cropped brown hair and blue eyes. They were all a bit overfed and wore similar brown felt hats. "What's the meaning of such a surprise?" Alan laughed nervously, patting the middle-aged Samson's back. "Alan," Simpson replied, looking around the neatly kept room, his eyes resting briefly on the basket of half-finished mending. "Sorry to have to bother you like this. I hope we did not wake your little sister." He continued to look around the room. JoBeth spied down at the men, her heart beating against her rib cage uncontrollably. "The boys and I need to have a talk with you," Simpson said, looking back at Alan. The other two men examined the house with their eyes, searching for something. They turned on cue when Simpson spoke and sat down uninvited at the table. Alan took the money he and Jonah had been counting and placed it in a container on the shelf. He sat down with the other three men. Queenie, seeing that Alan sat calmly with the strangers, settled back at the fire and went to sleep. "Nice little home you got here," one of the men said. He was running his fingers across the fibers of the wooden table, admiring the handiwork. "Where did you find the time to fix it up? With work and all." He looked up, smirking at Alan. "I manage," Alan replied a little coolly. "Shauna helps a lot." He started tapping his fingers on his knees under the table. Jo Beth looked at Jonah crouched beside her under his bed. She placed her arm around his shaking shoulders. He tried to smile confidently at her, but failed. "Alan," Simpson said seriously, "the reason why we're here is because my little girl, Amy, is in school with your sister. Well, she says when she walked by here the other day, she saw a black boy and a white girl running around." Simpson stared at Alan, hoping to see him falter. "Rumor around town is that you and your sister aren't the only ones living up here." Jonah and Jo Beth clutched each other tightly in the loft. "Are there other people here?" Simpson asked, point blank. Alan stood up angrily, almost knocking his chair over. He grabbed it and held it steady. "Does it look like I have anyone else around here?" He glared at the faces of the 3 men he worked with. He felt the heat rise on the back of his neck as anger and dread enveloped him. Everything was going so well. Jo Beth even seemed to be happy. Nothing else had happened between them since the kiss, but she was always kind and sweet with him. He did not want things to change, and the 3 before him only posed problems. He had to think quickly. "I only wish I had a girl up here." Alan laughed, causing the other 3 men to laugh with him. Jo Beth did not find it funny. She felt fear rising in her throat, and she squeezed Jonah for comfort. "Yeah, don't we all?" laughed one of the other men. "A real saloon gal, yee-haw!" he wallowed. "Well, my Amy don't lie," Simpson said. Jo Beth and Jonah swallowed a lump forming in each of their throats. "But the doc thinks she might need specs." Simpson stood up from his chair as the other men followed suit. "If there is something going on up here," he said calmly to Alan, "I'd put a stop to it right away. We are God-fearing good folks. We don't want no messing around going on in our town." He looked straight into Alan's green eyes, telling him his true feelings. "Sorry to disturb you. We best be on our way." He paused, trying to lighten the mood. "Listen, there is a country dance at Mackenzie's on Saturday. Miss Josie's gonna be there. A young man like yourself ought to be thinking of settling down, especially with a little sister to think of. She needs a female around to teach her how to be a good wife and mother. Miss Josie would be a mighty good catch, and I know she has an eye for you." Alan blushed deeply. Miss Josie was Simpson's niece and not at all his type. She was a mindless creature who constantly hung out at the lumber yard, bringing him refreshments and baked goods. He was fully aware of her intentions and was not at all interested. "That seems fine," Alan lied. "I will have to look into it." Good, Simpson said. "Josie will be glad to hear it." Jo Beth felt sudden outrage. Who was Josie? Did Alan like her? What if he did? Dread enveloped her. What if Alan wanted to settle down? What would happen then? How would she fit into the picture? It had never occurred to her that Alan might want to marry. But then, why wouldn't he want to get married and have his own life? She was a fool to think he would always be there to protect and care for her. One day he would want to move on. Maybe he already wanted to move on with this Josie. "Well, boys, come on. Let's get a move on before the women folks start to fret. Goodbye, Alan, and mind what I say. We like you and want to keep it that way," Simpson said, opening the door, looking serious. "Don't worry," Alan said too loudly as he watched them walk away. Jo Beth could tell he was jittery, and her heart went out to him. Alan was always concerned about how she and Jonah felt about being hidden away. They had never even thought how hard it might be for him to pretend they were not there. It must have been difficult juggling 2 different lives. She'd been so content that it never occurred to her. "Come on down," Alan said after a bit of time had passed. JoBeth let out a long sigh and relaxed. "That was too close for comfort," Jonah said, helping her down the ladder. "You're telling me," Alan replied absently. His mind was a mile away. Something told JoBeth things were going to change once again.